Welcome to another episode of the Breakneck Podcast. You have Matt Pashensky, and next to me is Ian.
Hello, Matt.
We are talking about doom and gloom today. End of all capitalism is at hand, according to Citrini Research and their very bearish report, which I think is making a lot of people really upset for this reason. Obviously, it's made stocks go down, people believe, about 2% yesterday, something like that. It had, there's so many stocks that are just getting annihilated when Anthropic announces that they're doing security. Oh, man, CrowdStrike gets slammed. They announced that they are supporting COBOL. IBM gets slammed. And then this report comes out that says all business everywhere is going to zero. And the whole market takes a shift. It's a silly report, but I don't think the fact that it's silly is what's making people upset. And I'm already tipping my hand. It's the fact that they wrote a silly report and it is absolutely crushing. It's gone super viral. And I think there's something deeper. And as I have matured, I've gone from a very much like, if something is wrong, and my wife gives me shit about this, if something is even a little wrong, you're a physicist, and the standard in physics is if you're even a little wrong, physicists, they get paid too little. They are extremely persnickety. You make a slight error, your reputation is done. There's no bullshit in physics. It's zero bullshit. And so I come into business, and you see some of these reports, and you know how I am. We've reviewed a bunch of these. We did the Doom 2027 Doom paper, and since then, I perhaps matured because I was like, this is bullshit. None of this stuff is verifiable. But it had a major impact and it affected how people looked at the world. And I think that's how we should evaluate the Citrini report, which is it is making people really evaluate stocks that they said, well, it's got, SaaS is great or this company's great. Why would it ever be affected by AI? And this report, while not compelling on its factual merits, in my opinion, is having that effect of changing how people perceive things. So anyway, let's go through the report. Have you read it? I've read it.
It's called the 2028 Global Intelligence Crisis. They position it as a sort of a thought experiment. They lay out a scenario. I liked it. It was a good read. It brings up a bunch of topics and a perspective that I think we haven't seen in the other papers that we've analyzed. Certainly more of a financial bent on the whole thing, which is, is kind of refreshing and interesting. Couple of interesting things maybe to kick off the conversation. Actually, it's pretty deep in there, but one of the things that I did not foresee being an issue is this notion of the existing payment rails that we use. But as an entrepreneur, it's always struck me how much time and effort we put into payments, moving money, right? It is a very core of what we do. There's been a trillion startups, and I've had a few of them related to fintech. And so they mention in here the sentence is the velocity of money flatlined. And I was like, holy shit, what does that even, I know what it means, but like how do you get to that? And the point they were making is that as we move into an agent-powered economy, the bigger point is you take friction. Agents deal with the friction. We have all these businesses built around friction. And so if you take that friction out, you say to yourself, okay, friction costs nothing to overcome. What does that mean? And when you get all the way down into the core of our economy, which is this money moving, we're beholden in the US to credit cards for the most part. And let's say ACH. And there are other ways to move money, but there's so much friction around moving those that we pay this 2%, 3% tax, or the merchants do, which means we do as consumers. And so the point was, long-winded way of getting to the point, is that agents are looking at this saying, well, I don't care, I'm not optimizing for tokens here. I need to optimize for cost in this example. So I'm going to route around MasterCard, Amex, Visa.
I think it's a lot of permutations on that central theme, which is why does DoorDash exist if anybody could do this? And why does this company exist if anybody could do this? And it's essentially exactly what you're saying is that they realize that and it's a very compelling case that friction will go down and that a lot of companies' moats will evaporate. But they make that case over and over again, and they say, well, then where do people get paid from? And the
Mhm.
velocity money gets, and what they're effectively doing is making a lot of micro cases that add up to an aggregate macroeconomic impact. And then my main critique of this paper is they say, wow, what if all of these micro, like payment structure type effects happen? Then where's all the demand come from? But they
Mhm.
don't address how the actual macroeconomic balancing of the economy. If one company gets smaller, then other companies get bigger. So they do a case by case of look at all of these companies and their moats evaporating, but they don't evaluate that there are partner companies in the economy which will experience this contraction effect far less. And now those companies have no costs, have much lower frictions, and therefore will expand. If these come, and so basically what they're describing in micro is, man, look at the profitability of all these companies getting very bad. But in macro terms, if you look from a macro lens, which they never really take that macro lens, like what happens to interest rates and the overall economy. Well, what you're describing is productivity getting really, really good, which is deflationary, right? If productivity gets really, really good, people will have a sense of, if I just waited 6 months, why buy this computer now? I could buy it in 6 months and it'll have the new AI chip in it that will be even more effective, right? Well, why would anyone spend? And so then if productivity goes up, the economy expands, but also what's going to happen is deflationary effect is going to
Mhm.
counteract our persistent high inflation. We haven't had good productivity for 15, 16 years now. Really, since the 90s, we haven't had a sustained period of high productivity growth. And what will happen is we'll have the same thing. We'll have a growing economy, growing tax base. Our overall costs will stay fixed, whereas our tax base will expand. That means we'll have less interest on the debt. Less Federal Reserve will need to charge a lower interest rates. Companies will be able to take out gigantic loans relative to now, expand operation, material abundance. That's what ends up happening when all of these gatekeepers, like, yeah, Visa and MasterCard might have some issues, or DoorDash might have lower margins, but the overall expansion of the economy is going to more than make up for it. And essentially at the core of this, sorry, I'll stop here, but at the
Well,
core,
yeah.
they just don't realize they're expecting that the interest rates will stay much higher for much longer and will enter a deflationary trap. And they never use those terms, but that's exactly what they're describing. And I don't think it's that. I don't think it's going to happen.
So I'm not an economist, and let me just state that up front. But they talk about this concept of ghost GDP.
Mm-hmm.
So, and GDP is, I don't know how long we've been using GDP, but it's a measure of essentially human enabled productivity, or it's closely related to that, right? And what they were saying as I read it was that um, you're now getting sort of machine generated GDP, and they call it ghost GDP. And the profits associated with that accumulate in the pockets of an ever smaller group of people. And so you have the rest of us, let's say, that now are not nearly as productive as the machines. And so we don't have jobs anymore. And they have one of those micro scenarios they talked about where you have white collar workers losing their jobs and like, okay, let's move into the gig economy. And then you have this oversupply and that drives down salaries there. And then, by the way, the gig economy is disappearing anyway because we've got Waymos and all of that. So,
Yeah, and
but
what they're describing is like, okay, let's say that Waymos, right? And everyone looks at Waymos and they say, oh, it's more expensive than Uber, blah blah blah. But there's nothing stopping once Waymo has established in the minds of everyone that Waymo is safer, and it is 10x safer, right? And there's no driver. There's nothing stopping Waymo from offering a Waymo that's this big, right? Or something to that effect. And Claire and I worked on a concept many years ago. She might have brought it to you. We called it Packet. I have a very small naming space for companies,
yeah,
but it's
me
essentially
too.
if what if you had delivery vehicles inside delivery vehicles, and so instead of having a Waymo an Uber Eats show up with one car, no, they had like a mothership, and then 10 little Uber Eats came out of that. Like you could drive down the cost between automation, capital depreciation. Electric cars have a far longer lifespan and lower cost structure so that's another shift that's happening. And then you can just make tiny little ones, and you can serve a whole neighborhood for 1/100th the cost that it has now. Once you have that, like, all your stuff is locked in, your electric cars, it's all super compact. You don't have to have any space for a human inside. Okay, wow, that's a compelling future. That's going to crush DoorDash. Or will it in fact allow everyone to have ready-made food that's delivered within 4 or 5 minutes of when it comes out of the kitchen? And that's the Jevons paradox that everyone keeps talking about. If the cost goes down, actually now you're going to have massive amounts. When at the same time, if everybody is now getting all of their foods and things delivered by robots, and those robots are in fact far smaller, we don't have any traffic. And so we can build huge amounts of housing without causing traffic jams in cities. But now there's net migration in the US because we have all these houses and there isn't the same anti-immigration. There's all of these compounding effects. And again, when you examine the microscopic or the local effect on a company like DoorDash and not take into the fact that, like, under the scenario that you just described, it effectively no longer makes sense for anyone to ever leave their house. And the only thing that they would ever do is use DoorDash or an equivalent service. It's like, so DoorDash is under pressure in their existing model, but the potential for DoorDash to be the beneficiary through a partnership with Waymo and have a super high margin business, a data layer business on top of Waymo, it's incredible. So it's like, what is the actual effect going to be? And this Citrini and this thing continually only looks at the downside by focusing on specific companies rather than examining the macro, which reveals that if you make things more productive, faster, and cheaper, it in fact inflates the economy overall because you
Well,
could
the
produce.
one macro thread that is throughout is this idea that you're going to have, they believe, mass unemployment of white collar workers
Mhm.
who are most of the discretionary spend in the economy, and that to me is plausible, even if that's just for a period of time. And so, again, I'm not an economist, right? But that's huge impact on your tax basis locally, federally, which is a point that they make. And then you have this huge amount of profit accumulating in the corporations.
Mhm.
And so you would need to adjust that tax strategy to grab more taxes from the corporation to make up for the taxes that you have lost. And
Yeah, and
so,
I was keeping a couple words in mind as I'm reading this whole essay that I never saw. They don't ever talk about the consumer price index. They don't talk about inflation. They don't talk about the Federal Reserve rate. They don't talk about antitrust, right? Like,
mhm.
all of those things are macroeconomic stabilizers, which do the following, right? Let's say that the need for human beings went down by 97%. What would happen? Well, guess what? It's already happened. 87%, whatever. 90% of the US population in the year 1900 or something equivalent, maybe it's 70%. Don't get me on the numbers. Again, I have matured. I don't care about details anymore. I'm not a physicist anymore. Something like 90% of the US worked in agriculture in 1900. Now it's 3%. And similarly, the amount of, even in an agricultural state, California only has 3% of its overall GDP contributed by agriculture, which takes up of the, arable land in California, like 90%. I mean, they grow almonds in the desert and alfalfa in the Salton Sea. They're doing a huge amount. Like, and also, like, 90% of water in California, by the way, is just used to do, like, just flood deserts to grow stuff. Like, everyone's like, "Oh, there's not enough water in California." It's like, no, like, a lot of water is used for free. Anyway, my point is, agriculture has this outsized impact on our mind, and it used to be almost all employment, and it's been entirely automated. Right? The AI revolution came for agriculture during the 20th century to the point there's almost no employment, and there would actually be even less than 3% if we didn't subsidize through a water and land use policy agriculture to an enormous extent, right?
Mhm,
Otherwise, we
mhm.
wouldn't grow alfalfa for Saudi Arabian horses and almonds for, Asian consumption, and no one would even notice, right? So it could be 1% of the economy and we wouldn't notice, right? And so and we still have way more food per person in the United States than we ever had. And it just didn't affect the economy, right? Because we found other stuff to do. And the way the economy works is, if we're trying to target 2% inflation every year. Now, if suddenly, because of, and this is what happened to agriculture, instead of us spending 50 or 70%, like they do in developing countries and like we used to do in the United States, of our income to feed ourselves, and that was the main constraint for our business. Now people spend 20%, but I know, having been a grad student for many years, that you can spend $5 or $6 a day and eat fairly well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who knows what I spend now? If I leave the house, money just flies out of my wallet these days. So we could spend maybe 2 or 3% of our total expenditure. We end up doing 20% because we like eating, Chili's and fancy restaurants and stuff like that. But we can spend 2 or 3% and feed ourselves as well as someone in
Mm-hmm.
1900. But what happens is the supply of money just expands to support all kinds of crazy investments and other stuff that we wouldn't even consider necessary right now. And it's already happened in agriculture. It's just automation completely took away all employment, and we just allowed money to fund any other thing in the world, and we never noticed.
I yep, get all of that. Industrial Revolution, somewhat similar. The only issue here, the only issue here is time. And these guys are predicting 2028, which actually I quite enjoy this because I read it and I'm like, I don't believe 2028. It's just not going to happen that
Mhm.
fast. But here's a question for you. Let's say various flavors of these kind of micro scenarios that they laid out are, let's say they all happen at some level. How long do you think we need? And let's keep it just to the US to adjust to this and not have catastrophe happen, let's say.
We proved during COVID that we can respond extraordinarily quickly to macroeconomic shocks, right? World War II was a horrible shock that actually produced benefits. And, like, as an example of like shocks in the economy, like, yeah, they can be really bad. They can actually be good. If you look at, and this is funny, if you look at the economic productivity, and they've done these studies of areas of London that were bombed in the Blitz
Mm-hmm.
badly versus ones that were not bombed in the Blitz too badly. The long-term economic growth of the areas that were bombed more heavily was higher than the ones that were not bombed, right? So this idea that shock is necessarily going to produce a negative impact is a core assumption of this paper. I think is a really reasonable thing. And like I said, I'm trying to be very charitable of this paper, despite its obvious lack of rigor, right? It's just a guy, and he crushed it. As far as, if you think of it as like a serious academic report, horrible, not
Yeah.
you could never quote this paper. Nothing about it is defensible. As a shit post on the internet, the best I've ever seen. Like, one of the great, everyone's so mad because someone wrote such a crappy paper that had this big impact. But embedded in is this core assumption that our macroeconomic response to this will lag. And they actually do have a little section in the middle where they're like, and because, employment lags by, months and months, this huge hollowing out of white collar will happen so quickly, and we'll have lagging indicators that, and they don't make this case explicitly, but they kind of said this, that effectively the Fed is not going to drop rates, and people are going to continue spending long after they don't have a career anymore. And it's going to create a bunch of people who are essentially unemployable, and our response will be far too late. And we're going to get a macroeconomic shock that the Fed will not be good enough to support. Yeah, that might happen.
Yeah.
But in
I
the
mean,
last few years, that does not seem like the way that the U.S. has been running their economy, is like allowing a big recession, and especially for upper class people, like a huge like alteration in lifestyle. What they'll do is they'll just drop interest rates. Effectively, the reason this is happening is because goods are getting cheaper, so there won't be inflation. And
mhm.
then will we have the ability to drop interest rates all the way to zero and then do big fiscal stimulus like we did during COVID? But if we're in a deflationary cycle, that's the proper response. It won't have any bad fiscal effects because all of our interest rates will be dropping on our debt. We'll have this big expansion in actual profits, which means our even though it'll be coming from a small sector of the economy, we'll still have a lot of taxes coming in. I don't know. Seems like something that would work itself out pretty well.
Yeah, it's the comparison to COVID's really interesting. It makes me think that in we some flavors of this stuff is going to happen. Right, I have no doubt. Question is more around timing. If it happens slowly over 10 years, it's fine. We'll work our way through it. If it happens in 3 months, we'll actually be fine too, because it'll be just so obvious we'll have to act. There's somewhere in between that where it's the slow, the water's slowly boiling where you're like,
Mm.
do we need to respond? Let's wait another little while. I don't know how the policy response gets triggered.
And then so we can kind of like leave behind the Citrini report with that. I think we've given a good overview. And I think exactly what you're saying is the crux, which is, does it happen in a way that all of our natural responses to this type of productivity boom actually cause a problem? And that's the core, is that are we going to have, and actually in that way, this report and the fact that it was so influential, despite it being trash academically, actually is going to inoculate it. Think of it as a vaccine against a very poor policy response to something that's very likely going to happen, which is, far fewer young people being employed. We've already had this for 2 or 3 years now in the software engineering, which is
Yep.
enormous, right? There's
Yep.
400,000 people. You're talking about high end, the top 5% of employees. That's like 6 million people. Well, we've already had like a microcosm of that, which is in roughly 10% of the upper end of American white collar work. The same effect: young people not being employed, mass layoffs. And I have friends that have been out of work for 2 years. They happen to have big savings and stuff like that, and they're finding employment. I think there's going to be a lot of these new opportunities, and these people are very creative. Yeah, they might have just spent their last, like all of us have spent their last 20 years of their work life sending emails, but they're also, extraordinarily smart. And this is the reason America has continued to be successful, is that these kinds of people. I've been talking to people all week, and I told you it's been a crazy few weeks for me. I'm talking to people who are kind of like looking at AI, and they're like, "Man, this is going to completely fuck my industry." And we've been working with them and be like, okay, well, what would you do? And they describe exactly the application. And we're like, well, we can build that in weeks rather than months, or weeks rather than years. And we're going to see a lot of that, just like this weird stuff popping out of nowhere, just like we saw with the iPhone. All these new applications like Uber and DoorDash and stuff like that you would have never dreamed of are going to be springing out into existence. And it's already happening. I'm seeing it. I told you it's been a crazy couple weeks for us.
Yeah.
That's the flip side of all of this productivity boom, is there's going to be lots of small entrepreneurs, and you're going to have all of these people who have nothing to do with technology that will suddenly become technologists because AI has made that available to them. But again, we're inoculating ourselves against that. And I think people are going to start to think about that a lot more. And it could go bad, but it could also be a boom in much smaller businesses, which startups have been strangled for 3 or 4 years. No
Yeah.
startups. And we're going to
Yeah.
see a bunch of profitable young companies that are based on AI just springing into existence over the next 18 months. And maybe some of them will get very big and employ a bunch of people. I have no idea exactly how it's going to work. But the fact that we can't see it, we do have historical analogies.
Yeah, we certainly do. All right, Matt, anything that has happened this week that caught your attention outside of the report?
Geez, every week it's this, but I'm never prepared.
I know. I tell you what, do you want to take a moment? Because I've got something.
Please, please.
Often I say, I kind of pitch that question of, what came across your desk this week that was of interest? Show you what came across my desk.
Oh, this is the big payoff. If you
There
watched the
we go. I've
last
got to cover
episode,
this part, but
well, you got the blue one and not the gray one. What
no,
happened?
it's gray. It's gray. It's just my camera is probably not showing it very well.
Oh, is it one of
For those
those?
who are A, not watching, and B, going, what the heck is that? Last week, we did the most mind-blowing technology real-time demo I've ever been involved in, and an agentic commerce demo. We had my OpenClaw bring us through the experience of purchasing something. So it's pretty amazing, Matt, when something shows up at your front door that a computer has purchased for you. So anyway, still reeling from that. I've had so many different conversations with people. I got invited to a conference last week to speak exactly on this stuff. So that has been super, super exciting, the agentic commerce stuff. And then the other thing that is kind of on the back burner a little bit for me, boiling in the background, is Anthropic's economic index reports. I don't know if you've seen those.
I
We
did not.
referenced one
That's the
late
newest.
last year, but they've been doing a series of reports sort of.
We covered one.
Yeah, we did. And they're trying to understand the economic impact. And one of the things I spent about 15 minutes, but they had surveyed I think 300 different types of roles, everything from software developer, computer programmer, they're different apparently, to, psychiatric nurses. And the question was, to what level are you using AI? Either is it replacing tasks, is it supplementing tasks, or not doing anything? The really interesting thing is they broke these roles into a job's a bundle of tasks, right? So they sort of
And this is when we're
attempted.
like software engineers were all using AI and everybody else is at 0, even though,
That
as
was
we've
the old
discussed.
version. That was
Yeah.
the old. But so this has a 300 of them, and so each job has these numbers of boxes. A box corresponds to a task, and then the question is that task done autonomously now for you? Is it supplemented with AI, or are you doing it completely on your own? Two things that were interesting about it: every single job had some level of AI involvement. And then the other thing that was really interesting to me, and you probably get this better because spend a lot more time in it. These jobs are broken down into a bundle of tasks. Some of them had 25 tasks, and some of them had 10 tasks. Why do I think that's interesting? I think it's interesting because we can begin to understand the likelihood of whole jobs being automated. Because
Mhm.
it's actually a sense of complexity is not quite the right word, but jobs are messy, right? If you're a psychiatric nurse, you've got 25 different tasks. It's a messy thing. So your role is probably a little bit uh, more unstoppable
Mhm.
versus other roles. So
One chart that I saw going around was like, it was a, 1 dot for every 3.3 million people on Earth, and however many dots that equals, right? And the whole point was the number of people who've ever used a coding agent was 3 million out of 8 billion people. And, it's a little bit silly. It's like, that's pretty advanced type of AI use. It's only been around for a couple months. How are you even measuring this and so on? But, nobody is using AI at all. Is should be your basic orientation towards things. Gigantic companies, you can go in and still shock them with things that we've talked about on this podcast for months, right? I don't wanna give away the game, but I have friends that are using very simple AI tools, and I'm not gonna give away the game. Very simple AI tools. I have my secret club, and they're getting consulting contracts, they're getting paid off of just going in and using things for half an hour, and people think they spent 5 days on them. Like, nobody knows. I see contracts going out for software, and they're using 2015 prices on stuff that can be done very quickly. I don't wanna say how quickly. I don't wanna give away the game. If you're out there experimenting with AI, experimenting with Claude Code, experimenting with agents and the things we're talking about, I've seen in the last 2 weeks, there's so much demand to bring this into companies. And because almost no one has used it, almost any company you talk to assume they've never heard of AI and they will think you're a magician. And it's one of the biggest opportunities in consulting I've ever seen. And there's probably gigantic product opportunities that are resilient, but you really just do have to leave behind the SaaS world and your mindset about what those things are and you just have to get your feet dirty, hands dirty, feet wet. But like I think the assumption is there's a lot of people who are now just taking advantage of basic tools and crushing it.
yeah, and I think the extra good news is if you're listening to the Breakneck podcast, and I say this in jest a little bit, but if you're part of this conversation, you are in that chart. You're in that top,
Just that
fraction of
one
1%.
tiny little part of this gigantic chart is anybody who's even touched AI.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's
So
so much
you're
opportunity. Look, just, it's like they talked about like only X number of people bought the Velvet Underground's first album when it came out, and every single one started a band. Like, go get Claude Code. Go get
yeah,
Claude Code Pro. Go get Gemini Pro and use Notebook LM. Use Nano Banana. Use Codex if you are one of those people.
yeah. At a minimum, absolute minimum, if you're listening to us, you have to be on a paid plan. You've got to be
Yes,
using the best model at an
$20
absolute
a month
minimum.
is
Yeah,
less than you're spending at the Olive Garden or wherever it is you choose to eat. I don't wanna make fun of the places I eat, and I'm not gonna mention them, but I don't eat the golf. It's one meal.
yeah.
Buy it.
Yeah.
Install it on your computer. Ask it how to do it, and then just do what it says. You will immediately enter into this elite group of people, and you will shock your coworkers at most companies. If you're working at a savvy place, great, good. Hopefully they do well on that. But yeah, I don't think it's related to Citrine. I don't think anyone's really priced it in yet, and it's going to be, I think, a lot of fun. I'm excited. I like weird stuff. I've oriented myself towards novelty and doing podcasts about the future and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
is really paying off, and we're not even talking about is AI a bubble anymore. I think it's just like, okay, how quickly is this going to sweep over the economy? And to kind of bring it home on Citrine, the stock market is now pricing in that AI is going to have very big impacts, and everybody's now fighting about what those impacts are going to be.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's land it there, Matt. Another good one in the books.
Thanks, Ian.
See ya. Bye bye.
Bye bye.